So I am the second presenter. My name is Phillip Zapkin. I work as an assistant teaching professor at Penn State University, which means I don't ever get tenure, but I get a lot of teaching. I work in the English department there. I got my PhD actually last spring from West Virginia University, and the paper that I'm going to be presenting for you today, Iphigenia Alone, Metatheatre and Austerity in Gary Owen's monologue play Iphigenia in Splott, picks up on my general interest in adaptations of Greek tragedy. Gary Owen's 2015 play Iphigenia in Splott ends with an overt anti-austerity warning. Effie, the lone character in the 75-minute monologue play, ends her narrative describing life in her Cardiff neighborhood. More and more people packed in this little plot of land while they cut everything we need to make a life. And we can take it. We can take it because we're tough, the lot of us. But here's the fucking rub. It seems it's always places like this and people like us who have to take it when the time for cutting comes. As a number of theater reviewers have pointed out, this is an aggressively political ending to the play. In the New York Times, Ben Brantley said the play is a work with a confrontational social conscience, a state that's rarely conducive to subtlety. By the play's end, Owen's critique of the human cost of austerity politics is abundantly clear as Effie's final didactic indictment of neoliberal politics, and the audience's complicity in those politics follows the tragic loss of the baby she had hoped could bring stability to her life. But fundamentally, this presentation is not about the overt political element of Iphigenia in Splott's conclusion. I'm happy, obviously, to talk more about that in the conclusion, or in the Q&A, rather. Instead, in this presentation, I argue that the play's form prefigures its political stance. Even before the socio-economic critique, the metatheatrical monologue form helps perform Owen's critique of economic injustice. Specifically, by collapsing the Greek Iphigenia story into a one-person show, Iphigenia in Splott substitutes the civic collectivity of ancient Athenian theater for the socio-economic isolation of individual consumers under neoliberal capitalism. As you may have already guessed, Iphigenia in Splott bears only scant resemblance to Euripides' Iphigenia in Aulis, which is the most direct Greek source for Owen's play. In essence, all that connects Owen's loose adaptation with its Euripidean predecessor is the narrative of sacrificing a child for the greater good. Effie, a tough, street-smart chav played by Sophie Melville in the original Sherman Theatre production, recounts a one-night stand with Lee, a retired soldier. Effie is crushed when she finds out he's married and she's pregnant. After initially deciding on an abortion, Effie changes her mind and decides to keep the baby. But when she goes into early labor, the hospital doesn't have enough beds in the special care unit, so they send her to the next town. But when the ambulance crashes and Effie delivers her very premature daughter, the paramedics are unable to save the baby. Devastated, she sues the hospital, but drops the suit after the hospital's midwife convinces Effie that the money she would collect would force the hospital to close more beds and diminish their services further. It is with this guilt that Effie ultimately confronts the audience. I took this pain and saved every one of you from suffering the same. Your baby gets sick, she gets well, because of me. But again, my focus in this presentation is on how the reduction of the Greek tragedy, with its chorus and role in Athenian civic life, to a monologue play mirrors the austerity politics that Owen critiques, and how Effie's metatheatrical addresses implicate the audience. Athenian drama was a collective civic ritual, meaning it drew all citizens together along with a range of non-citizens. The chorus was a key role in tragedy, representing a collective voice always prepared to remind the protagonists of the larger implications and stakes of their actions. As Margarita Leera puts it, through melody and choreography, the chorus stood at the symbolic center of a collective religious ritual, the city Dionysia, mirroring the audience and symbolically incorporating it into the show. Thus, the texture of Attic tragedy incorporated a reminder that life in the polis was always shared, always collective. As part of the city Dionysia, which was a major religious festival, theater depended for its affective impact on communal experience. And this collective aspect was built into the very structure of the theater of Dionysus. According to Samuel Shanks, the theatron was also organized the spectators spatially in a way that allowed them easily to see the faces of most of the other spectators. The ability to easily perceive the reactions of the rest of the members of the polis doubtless contributed a great deal of communitarian energy. And this communitarian energy channeled back into the shared political life of Athenian democracy, which emphasized the responsibility of citizens to serve the polis, to preserve the life and shared good of the city-state. Today, on the other hand, under neoliberal ideology, the notion of the public good or of collective responsibility to society as a whole has been substantially undermined. We see this distinctly in Iphigenia and Splott. Effie reflects on the businesses and services that once existed in the neighborhood, all closed now due to budget cuts, job losses, and diminished social support. She linguistically distances herself from this suffering by putting the words into her nan's mouth, saying, "She says we used to live. You could live here and live well. Now they're stacking us up and we're supposed to just exist." But in narrating the night at the club where she met Lee, Effie experiences a profound change. After she has sex with the ex-soldier, she tells us, "Lying there wrapped up in Lee, I'm feeling something new. And something new is not alone. I'm not alone, and it feels like I'm going to feel not alone always." This idea of being not alone becomes something of a refrain throughout the next portion of the play, a phrase that Effie clings to even as it becomes increasingly clear that Lee is not going to call her. There are more layers to this not aloneness than I have time to go into in this brief presentation, but the most important facet is precisely the feeling's ephemerality. Not just in the obvious sense that Lee is married to another woman and has no interest in a relationship with Effie, but in the sense that she really is alone. Alone on a stage where once her Grecian predecessor would have had a chorus and other actors. In Iphigenia and Splott, there's virtually nothing on stage to support Effie during her monologue. In the Sherman Theatre production, The Set, designed by Haley Grindle with lighting by Rachel Mortimer, had only a few hard plastic chairs as props and a row of horizontal fluorescent light bulbs, some fallen at odd angles, making up the backdrop. This space suggests urban decay in a declining Britain. As reviewer Andrew Hayden wrote in The Guardian, set in a bleak world of strip lights evoking everything from nasty nightclubs to rundown hospitals, the play is underscored with low rumbles of bass, machines, and thunder, so much so that you can almost feel the cuts being made to austerity Britain while you watch. Against this sparse setting, Effie tells her story, dances, rages, and weeps. Not only does the set suggest the decimated infrastructure of an austerity-stricken Cardiff, its starkness highlights just how alone Melville is on the stage. Not only does she not have anyone else to interact with, except the audience, there are almost no physical props to support her performance. Like the deceptive summons for Iphigenia to come marry Achilles in Euripides' play, Effie's feeling of not aloneness is illusory and destined to lead to her sacrifice. And the notion of sacrifice is, according to Wendy Brown, at the heart of neoliberal austerity politics. In this sense, Effie's story profoundly differs from Iphigenia's, because while Iphigenia was an individual sacrificed under unusual circumstances, Effie sacrifices and is sacrificed, paradoxically at the same time, as part of a political economic theology. As Brown explains, individuals are required to provide for themselves in the context of powers and contingencies that radically limit their ability to do so, but they are also blamed for the woes of the whole and, more importantly, even when behaving properly, may be legitimately sacrificed for its survival. Instead of being secured or protected, the responsibilized citizen tolerates insecurity, deprivation, and extreme exposure to maintain the productivity, growth, fiscal stability, credit rating, or market dominance of the firm or nation, or again of the firm on the of the nation on the model of the firm. That's a very long quote, sorry. But there's good stuff in it, so it's worth it. What this means is that contemporary neoliberal discourses seek to blame the poor, the oppressed, and the dispossessed for not sufficiently investing in themselves as human capital, and are simultaneously always prepared to assign blame for larger financial instability to the poor, the oppressed, and the dispossessed, whom it then seeks to sacrifice for the greater good. These sacrifices come in the form of abolished social programs, decreased funds for education or job training, or, as is evident in Iphigenia and Splott, cuts to health care and social services. As cuts are passed on to the vulnerable, Brown argues, neoliberal ethics demand the poor bear these hardships stoically. She writes, "This citizen releases state, law, and economy from responsibility for and responsiveness to its own conditions and predicaments, and is ready to sacrifice to the cause of economic growth and fiscal constraints." Effie's metatheatrical addresses to the audience are riven by the paradox of the neoliberal subject, at once enjoined to think of itself in purely economic terms of exchange, debt, and capital, and simultaneously to sacrifice itself for the larger economic whole, embodied, of course, in corporations, the wealthy, and stock values. Effie's two most striking metatheatrical moments come at the opening and the closing of the play, and they represent these competing poles. At the beginning of the performance, Effie uses economized language. "You lot, every single one, you're in my debt. And tonight, boys and girls, ladies and gents, I've come to collect." She opens, in other words, by conceptualizing the theater-going experience, and her presence before us, as a financial transaction, a paying of debts. This opening prepares us for the Effie who pursues a lawsuit against the hospital after her baby's death. But it doesn't prepare us for the Effie who drops the suit, who follows austerity's sacrifice of her baby with the sacrifice of her own financial security. And make no mistake, this is an economic decision. Effie reflects, "And so, I drop the case. I don't make anyone pay." But is this a gesture of Effie's capitulation to neoliberal austerity? To the cultural imperative that the poor be sacrificed without complaint for the economic health of the corporate nation-state? Of course not. Unlike the subject that Brown describes, one battered down to accept their precarious sacrificial position unquestioned, Effie makes us witnesses to her sacrifice. Both in her renunciation of financial compensation and in her solitude on stage, we have the indictment of the neoliberal world order. We have her profound protest against the socio-economic system that has shaped her world, and that has taken from her the kind of civic collectivity supporting her Grecian predecessor. When the Iphigenia myth is condensed from a performance involving multiple actors, including a chorus, to a monologue play, the internal economy of the play fundamentally changes. Whereas Euripides' characters need only interact with one another, as is usually the case in Attic tragedy, Effie has no one with whom to interact apart from the audience, and so the play is laced through with metatheatrical challenges, accusations, appeals, and threats. What this means is that the audience is directly implicated in the sacrificial structure of the myth. In Iphigenia in Aulis, it is possible to think of ourselves as apart from the ethical causes and consequences of Agamemnon's sacrifice. Agamemnon kills his daughter, the Greeks sail to Troy. The world is good. Even by the time Euripides' play was staged in 405 BCE, the events were a mythologized history. The audience, then and now, is not to blame. But the immediacy of Effie's accusations make our guilt inescapable. In the death of her child and her choice to renounce whatever satisfaction would have been gained through a settlement, we as viewers cannot escape the confrontation with our own complicity in the economic system that prioritizes investments over the lives of the impoverished. This direct and unequivocal condemnation is a function of the play's monologic structure, which leaves Effie with no one to address but the semi-tangible figure of a theater audience. This isolation is neither innocent nor incidental, but is deeply rooted in the very political economy that Effie's tragedy evokes, the violence underpinning neoliberal capitalism. The anti-collective, anti-democratic impulses of neoliberalism erode public support networks, placing overwhelming burdens on the poor who are isolated further within an ideological system that values their lives less than corporate profit. Thank you.